Thanks for tuning in to Ancient Greece, Declassified. Episode 11, Caves and Classrooms. There are some who say, we don't need no education, we don't need no thought control. And there are others who have argued that education is the foundation of a well-functioning society. And this difference of opinion can be traced back all the way to antiquity, when on the one hand you have the likes of Plato, who infamously compared education, or rather miseducation, to being in a cave and watching shadows on a wall. You think you're learning something, but all in all, it's just another shade on the wall. On the other hand, you have the likes of Quintilian, the Roman orator who wrote extensively on education. He claimed that public education was absolutely crucial for a society, and he argued against homeschooling and expensive tutors. So these debates about education can be traced all the way back to antiquity, but also the names we use for our institutions derive from the ancient world. We refer to universities collectively as the academy. Many places in the world call their high schools lyceums, after the name of Aristotle's school, and many countries call their middle schools gymnasia, from the Greek gymnasion, which was an institution kind of like a gym, but really a social hangout spot that had classes and events and various cultural activities as well. And another connection between our education and the ancients is that what we think of as the Greco-Roman classics, the stuff you'd read in a classics course in college, these are the same books that kids in the Roman Empire read when they learned their classics. Homer, Euripides, Sophocles, Virgil, etc. Does that mean that education today is the same as it was in antiquity? Of course not. But there are enough similarities to make one wonder what it was like to go to school in the ancient world. However, if you are curious to know what it was like, it's extremely difficult to find that out, because there is no book that you can read from the ancient world that will transport you to the classroom. There is nothing analogous to Tom Sawyer or Harry Potter. There's no teen drama that has survived that makes you feel like you're in the classroom and you have a sense of what kids around you are doing. So the detective work that has to go into reconstructing what education was like back then is extremely difficult. You have to look at the few extant paintings of classrooms. You have to study the philosophers who wrote about education and try to extract information from there. And most difficult of all, you have to examine the archaeological remains of classrooms and of school materials. Interestingly, the only place where an abundance of such archaeological evidence remains is not in Greece or in Italy, but in Egypt. If you listen to our episode 1, you know that the dry climate and the desert sands of Egypt preserve antiquities better than any other place in the Mediterranean. Now, Egypt had a Greek administrative and educational system from Alexander's conquest until at least the 7th century AD, after the Islamic conquest. That's over 1,000 years. And so the fact that things are preserved so well in Egypt makes it an excellent place to study the archaeological evidence for Greek education. Our guest today has done the formidable detective work of synthesizing the iconography and the literature and the archaeological evidence. She is perhaps the world expert on education in antiquity, and I'm especially happy to welcome her on the show because she taught me ancient Greek in college. And apart from that, while in college, I participated in an excavation in Egypt that she was involved in, and it just so happened that during that excavation season, our team discovered, serendipitously, an ancient classroom. And we'll talk about that today. Raffaella Cribiore is professor of classics at New York University. She has written numerous books, including Gymnastics of the Mind, which is about education in antiquity, and which in 2004 won the prestigious Goodwin Award, which at the time was awarded to the best classics book of the year. So without further ado, Raffaella Cribiore, welcome to Ancient Greece Declassified.
Thank you.
So when most people hear ancient Egypt, they think of pyramids, pharaohs, mummies, hieroglyphics, but in your book, Gymnastics of the Mind, you studied the evidence in Egypt for Greek education. So how is it that Egypt came to have a Greek administrative and educational system?
So basically it's Alexander and his successors who took Greek, which at the beginning was just the language of small groups, but then became the language of administration, education. There is a very interesting fact about Egypt, which is that the Egyptians of the pharaonic period could not write hieroglyphics or hieratics because these scripts were tremendously difficult and needed a scribe. And so later, at the moment when Greek started to expand, the Egyptian did not have any way to write.
Mm-hmm. The common Egyptians.
Yeah, but also not just the common Egyptian, mm-hmm. the cultivated Egyptian.
So would you say that the simplicity and ease of learning and writing Greek allowed it to be a very effective tool of empire?
Absolutely, yes.
And so Greek, through the conquest of Alexander, became the administrative language in many places, like Egypt and the Middle East, stretching all the way to Persia for
Syria.
a while. Yeah. Can we compare that spread of Greek to the spread in recent centuries of English to much of the world? Is there a parallel there?
Yeah, in a sense, yes. Because now, you see, even me, I'm Italian, and I have to speak English. And I think of the Egyptian person who had to speak and write Greek.
Because it seems like with the conquest of Alexander, the Greeks had a very expandable business model. Like everywhere they went in the cities, they would build, a theater and a gymnasium and an assembly area. And that kind of reminds me of how now when countries become more globalized, they get TV with American TV shows and movie theaters with American movies and the internet and Instagram and everything. So was this process of building these institutions in the middle of every city, was that part of this spread of the Greek language and administration?
Yeah. It was a whole world that was transported there. Mm-hmm. But besides that, I always find useful to make a comparison with India regarding education. So the British exported their education in India, and although they in Great Britain changed some things, education in India was fossilized, was absolutely unchanged. The same happened with this.
Interesting, because in your book you say that despite the many socioeconomic changes in Egypt from, let's say, 300 BC to the 7th century AD, with the Roman conquest and then Christianity and everything, you write that the Greek educational system was remarkably constant.
Yeah, and the same in India.
Mm-hmm. So Egypt is a remarkable place to study because there's so much well-preserved evidence there. But somebody who is listening now or who first approaches your book might feel that it's, how can you extrapolate from this one region to say more general things about education? Because you write in your book that the evidence from Egypt gives us a view of the vast panorama of education around the Mediterranean. So what makes the evidence from Egypt helpful for us to understand a much wider area of educational institutions?
Essentially, what we knew of education before using the papyri, the ostraca, the evidence from Egypt, was, as you said before, kind of limited, yet some writers talked a little bit about their childhood, and Quintilian expanded so much in this. And then you go to Egypt, and you find the exact counterpart. You can put the literary evidence next to the Egyptian evidence. And yes, as I studied education there, I found some things that were not identical, but basically it was absolutely the same. I tend to say to my students when I teach them education, imagine if you, a Greek citizen from Syria, went to France, to Gaul, and talked to another student, you would have found a word in common. You were studying the same thing. You know, maybe in Latin, in some other places in Greek, but it was very fossilized.
Is it safe to say that there's a great homogeneity of educational practices across the Mediterranean from the 3rd century BC up to the 7th century AD?
I say yes. There were some little changes, of course.
Okay, so now that we've established that Egypt is a representative place to examine further, I want to quickly ask you about the native Egyptian non-Greek culture, because your book focuses on the Greek evidence, but you mentioned in your book that the native Egyptian language education still needs to be studied. And since then, I know that you've been doing a lot of research with the Coptic, which is the Egyptian script in the Roman times. So have you found anything interesting about the native Egyptian language education in the past few years?
You know, essentially, the 3 script of which I talked before, of the Egyptian, hieroglyphs, hieratic, and then demotic. In demotic, there are lots of school exercises. The fact that we don't know about that and a tiny little minority has been published, it's because they are very difficult to decipher. So if you imagine the peasant from and even before, but from the time of Alexander to basically the 3rd century, couldn't express himself in writing. So Coptic, which is a script, it's not a language. Coptic is Egyptian. It's the last stage of Egyptian. Coptic was invented, which I think is so phenomenal. They invented it because they could transliterate the Bible. And Coptic has 3 signs from Demotic, but the rest of the letters are all Greek letters.
So eventually, after like 500 years of Greco-Roman rule, the Egyptians adopted a simple alphabetic writing system.
Yeah.
Now, so you have these 2 linguistic communities in Egypt. You have the Greek-speaking population and the Egyptian-speaking population, and probably there were a lot of Egyptian speakers that also learned Greek to enter the administration. But how did these communities live parallel and separate lives, or were they more integrated with time?
Oh, not separate at all. And the same person could speak 2 languages. I would say all the Greeks in Egypt, or let's say the vast majority, knew Egyptian, and they worked side by side.
Do we find an analogous situation in other parts of the Greco-Roman world where you have people speaking a local language, but their educational system is in Greek?
Yes. For example, think of Syria. At that point, most of the population spoke Syriac or Aramaic, but the schools were in Greek.
Okay, so let's dive into Egypt and examine education there. So at what age did children start school usually?
This, I can give you a rough idea in the sense that Quintilian absolutely says children must start at 7. And probably many did, but in Egypt I also found some, at least 2 in 2 different papyri, who were starting education. They were 13. So I think that with the ancient world, you have to be very flexible because, approximately there were 3 basic levels of education. So elementary, which presumably went up until, 10 or something like that. Then 3 years of literary education with a grammarian, and then they went to college, those who went, but went at the age of 16, more or less.
Yeah. So there's 3 stages. So you have elementary, and then you have
grammatical,
education. And then you have
rhetorical.
Okay.
Yeah.
And granted that these were more fluid in terms of the ages of the students than we have today in our regimented system, is this kind of like primary and secondary and college?
Yeah, very similar.
Okay. So you mentioned that the evidence you look at for this is remains of papyri. Have you ever seen papyrus being discovered?
Yeah.
Yeah? What's it like?
Yes, but it was in fact Coptic. So one time I went up this mountain by myself to go to this monastery, Deir el-Bakhit. And when I arrived there, I said, "So, show me, what are you doing?" And all of a sudden, people start screaming, and they started pulling out of the ground these rolls and rolls of Coptic papyri. Oh,
so they just pull it out of the sand?
Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible.
Amazing.
Okay, so let's start with the primary educational level. And in your book, you had a nice metaphor. You said that this school might be like the elementary schoolhouse on the American frontier in the 19th century, where you might have like one teacher for all grades, and you might have children starting at different ages, and they're all mixed up in the same classroom.
Totally, yes.
So what segment of the population could afford to send their children to the elementary level?
I think elementary school didn't cost much, probably nothing. Maybe they gave a gift to the teacher. I found a papyrus where there is this little girl who goes to school, and then the father in a letter says, send the pigeons and the grapes to Heraidu's teacher. But otherwise, you have to imagine that this type of school, at elementary level, they could happen even, outside, under a porch, in a cave. So there was no need to have a building devoted to that.
But presumably they'd have to be free children, right? Or did slaves also go to elementary school?
The thing is a little complicated because I feel that there were different tiers. So, for example, the other day I was looking at 2 papyri that present a father in each one introducing a boy to a teacher. But this one was to learn stenography, shorthand. And the father is going to pay a lot of money for this. But which students are these? Probably slaves.
Wow. So the slaves were taught stenography in the sense that they were taught to write very quickly so that they could take down their master's instructions and stuff like that?
Yeah, stenography, has a huge importance in antiquity. So if you had a slave, And then he learned that you could be very happy because the slave brought you money.
Wow. Interesting. So if elementary school was so affordable and accessible, did the teachers make enough money?
I don't think so. A little, yeah, but teachers have been in difficult positions during those centuries. They never earn this great amount of money. The only evidence I found, in fact, was of gift. Later, we are talking about the elementary school. Later, it was costly.
But at the elementary level, was there any kind of state or city sponsorship of these schools? I mean, teachers can't just live on gifts of grapes and pigeons.
No, I'm sure they did other thing, or maybe the parents gave them some money, but there is no evidence at all about that. There is evidence of money at the level of the grammarian.
Okay.
So,
which is the secondary level. So what about the gender balance? Because you mentioned a papyrus where there's a girl going to school. Did girls and boys have equal access to this first stage of education?
I think so, but definitely there were less girls. But again, we don't know. But there is evidence of girls in a primary school. Later on, at higher stages, the evidence practically disappears.
Interesting. What did the classroom look like? Did the children have desks, or was the teacher sitting down or standing up, or what was the arrangement?
There were no desks in antiquity. They started later and in the Middle Ages. But again, where did they sit? There is evidence of a writer who says, children are sitting with their teacher at the crossroads. Or they could be, sitting in a cave. I always think caves would be really excellent because there are so many in Egypt and they're cool and you can even go in the summer.
So they didn't have fixed, dedicated buildings for schools. Okay. So in an elementary school in the U.S. today, if a teacher wants to punish a child, the usual things they'll do are, say, go and stand in the corner, or they'll have some kind of detention. What were the preferred methods of punishment in ancient schools?
Physical punishment was really widespread. Children usually were beaten with a strap.
Ooh.
Here, we have evidence of kind of cruel beating. And not just at the elementary level, but even in higher level.
There was a really interesting vase painting in your book that showed in Athens of the classical period what appeared to be a female teacher smacking a child with a slipper. Was that a common...
Yeah, and I have to say, I didn't put other vases, but whenever you have a school scene on a vase, those slippers are always hung on the wall.
They're hung on the wall?
Yeah.
So it's like a tool more than an actual footwear.
And there is an unbelievable vase in which you see the student who had marks from the slipper all over his body, from the top down to his feet.
Oh, wow. That's harsh. And what were they writing on in the classroom? What were they using as pens, first of all, and what were they writing on?
It depended on the writing material, because if they wrote on papyrus, then they needed a reed pen, which was kind of cheap, and not difficult to make, even for a parent. If they wrote...
So do you dip that in ink or what?
Yeah.
Okay.
If they wrote on tablets, tablets could be filled with a type of wax that was very fluid. I mean, one could really write easily on it.
So you draw in the wax, and then you can, because it's so soft, you can just smoothen it over.
You know, they used this pen, let's say, called stylus, that was metal. And then at the end, it had like a little tail. And so you could write, and then with the tail, you could smooth the writing. Then instead, if they had a tablet that was just made of smooth wood with no wax, they wrote again with a pen.
With ink?
Yeah.
And then they could wash it off and reuse it?
Yeah, usually these tablets had some kind of a coating. And so after a while, one could recoat it, and but they could just be erased with a sponge.
Well, papyrus and wooden tablets cost a bit of money, but there's a cheaper option, right? Just using potsherds if you're like a very poor student or teacher.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And again, those were written with ink and pen.
So then let's move on to the secondary level of education, which is headed by a grammarian teacher. What was the common age of students in that level, and what did they learn?
So roughly, let's say, from 10 to 14, something like that. And the education of the grammarian was exclusively literate. So he taught literature following a canon of text, Homer first, and then a little bit of some tragic poets. But what
So all poetry?
Only poetry.
Only poetry?
Yeah. And I still think it's very strange, this method, because if they wanted to start the Iliad, they started from book 1, but then they read maybe 200 verses with the teacher. And to me, the lesson was kind of, can I say, boring? Because there was no talking about Hector or the love for Andromache or what kind of phenomenal hero was Achilles. You had to learn all the words. Basically, these 200 verses were dissected in all possible way. But it's also a little strange for our taste to read the first and the second book from the Iliad. Book 1 and 2 from the Iliad were by far the most popular. And you know, we don't have a great love of book 2, the catalogue of ships and all that.
Yeah, it's pretty boring.
But they loved it.
So they really had to learn by rote, very meticulously, very carefully, the poetry, like word by word. And there were certain excerpts of the poems that were standardized as like the main thing you had to learn, like book 1 and 2 of the Iliad.
Yeah. Then they read book 6. But here we are going to the advanced student.
That sounds really boring, but there is an upside to that maybe, which is something I remember from your class in college, which is that after you go through this really boring schooling and you memorize all these passages, whether you're from Egypt or Syria or Greece, anywhere you travel and you meet people of your educational class, you guys all know the same poems by heart. at drinking parties, you can all do like a poetry slam. So it seems to have a social function of...
I agree with you entirely.
well, that's your idea.
No, but it was, you could... it was like a passport to be recognized, right?
One thing that struck me from your book about the canon of authors that were read at the secondary level of education was that these are the same classic authors that we think of today as the great ancient Greek authors. And I'm wondering, was the fact that they were already entered into the canon of classics back then, did that have an effect on their survival? Like, is that why those works survived the Middle Ages and so much other stuff didn't survive?
Completely, totally. So the canon became fossilized in the school, and then these texts were transmitted, maybe not entirely, but all the rest kind of fell through the cracks.
So let's move on to the third stage of education that you talk about in your book, the rhetorical stage, the School of Rhetoric, and this is a topic that you explore much more fully in your recent book called The School of Libanius in Late Antique Antioch. And Libanius is a famous orator and professor of rhetoric from the later Roman times. So from your research into schools of rhetoric and Libanius in particular, what can you tell us about this level of education in terms of the usual age and the affordability and accessibility of the students?
So I calculated the ages of all the students of Libanius to try to determine how many years they remained. And it was very, very diverse. So there were the people like the graduate students who stayed forever, like 7 years, 6 years. And these are those whom he says they will continue his work. They didn't, by the way. It was always very disappointing thinking, that mother, that uncle, they ruined me because this guy was going to be an educator. No, they want him to be a lawyer. So
he was hoping for these to be his successors?
Yeah,
take
exactly.
Over his school.
So this stayed for a very long time.
But they were just enjoying being a student, because it's fun to be a student.
Yeah, maybe.
I can attest to that.
And then if we go to the other end, there were students who stayed 2 years. Why? Because if they wanted to become lawyer in the retinue of some administrator or something, they just needed 2 years of instruction, but not much more. I don't think ever that they studied law in that school. The education was only literary. So
law school was separate?
Law school came after, and so it was really like getting a PhD, let's say. But the School of Rhetoric went up to, I don't know, let's say age 20, 22. But the thing that is strange to me is that imagine those students who stayed only 2 years and then became lawyers. What did they know about the law? Nothing. They had read Homer again, the tragics, and they had started to declaim. But that's it.
Wait, so you could do 2 years of the rhetoric school and then become a lawyer?
Yeah.
Without going to law school?
Exactly. These were the lawyers who were maybe on the first year, but they were in the retinue of these personages, and so many parents loved that because they could put a boy, here only boys, in a class of a rhetor for 2 years. That's it. It was expensive, and 2 years is 2 years, but 7.
Have you found any evidence of any woman that reached this stage?
If you go to Rome, apparently Cornelia, the mother of the Gracchi, knew rhetoric, and I mean, there were a few women.
Because we also know of like Hypatia in Alexandria.
Oh, the philosopher, absolutely. But these were all exceptions. And also I notice that the most important thing, when you get one of these women and you are able to know something about her parents, it is always that the father was a rhetor or he was a famous grammarian. Women painters, always. The father was a painter and he had shown his art to the daughter. Hypatia, same thing. Her father Theon instructed her in math. So from here you understand how sporadic are these cases.
Interesting. So you've been excavating for many years in the Dakhla Oasis in Egypt, and I was with you one season several years ago when we happened to the team found an ancient schoolroom. What level of education would that schoolroom have been used for?
So basically we found a room that belonged to the rhetor or maybe to a grammarian who did advanced stuff. Attached is a room with some literary text.
On the walls?
On the walls all the time. And again, even in that case, the walls were coated. They had a white coating, so they could write on it and erase. Then outside of the school, we found lots of students, ostraca, primary students, ostraca.
So little homeworks?
So maybe they were just sitting outside without being in the building.
So you think that was actually the home residence of the local rhetor or teacher of grammar?
No. I think, this was the residence of Serenos, who was a big deal in his town. And so attached to the house of Serenos and built a little bit previously, there was the school. When Serenos arrived in his house, he incorporated the school. I often thought that school, how many kids could contain? And even older children, I think 12 or something like that. Probably Serenos sent his own children, plus some children who lived, around. It's interesting that when you get into his house, the triclinium, the first
living room?
The living room and the receiving room, has all these scenes painted on the wall from the Odyssey and from several other myths. So Serenos, was he educated? A lot? Maybe not. But he certainly thought that these were tokens of good education.
That's fascinating that you've actually found the name of the owner of the house. So he was a local big deal, and whether educated or not, he definitely made a display of culture.
Absolutely.
And he might have sponsored a local mini school for his children, maybe the neighbor's children or something like that. Now, if I remember correctly, there were some really interesting phrases written on the walls, like inspirational phrases, like, "Oh, student, drink from the fountain of the muses," or something like that. So were those written then by the teacher in order to inspire?
They were definitely written by a teacher, because the handwriting is really graceful and proficient. And what he put on the wall were a series of epigrams, all in verse.
So mini poems?
Exactly. And so in one, in fact, and this is the thing that leaves me a little uncertain, because he says, okay, student, climb up the hill of learning. And he says that at the top there will be rhetoric. At the same time, what you see a lot of verses, all with accents. Greek has all these breathing marks, marks of length of syllables, complete. There is nothing in the word that can be compared to this. It's unbelievable. When you get a papyrus, maybe you get 2, 3 of these signs, but here every syllable has these particular signs, which are called lectional signs. Mm-hmm. They are useful when you read. Mm-hmm. And so here you have a whole, let's call it a blackboard, completely filled with this. So this is very interesting.
So if you had to put your money on whether this was a primary, secondary, or rhetorical level, what would you guess?
Yeah. So again, I'm in doubt because at the beginning I thought, okay, a rhetor, but are we expecting a rhetor in the oasis? Little dubious, unless it is somebody who retired and then... I think Quintilian speaks a few times about these grammarians, teacher of grammar, who are so ambitious, and then they start teaching rhetoric to the student. I would be inclined to view the situation like this. So a second level teacher who provided more because they had nobody else.
Because they were in the middle of nowhere, out in the desert. Okay. So how many of the students that would have gone to the elementary level, where you said it was very open to a large segment of the population, how many of those would make it all the way to the third stage of the School of Rhetoric?
Not many.
Mm-hmm. Very few.
Absolutely, yeah.
So in America today, if you don't make it to college, you're pretty much considered a delinquent.
Yeah.
Was there some kind of social stigma attached to not making it to the School of Rhetoric, or was it kind of natural that you probably wouldn't do that?
Yeah, natural, but also, how do we consider our middle school teachers? Okay, they're nice, they make a living, some of them teach very well, but go to antiquity. How do we consider the second tier, like the grammarian? Mm-hmm. Why? The grammarian could go and see the emperor. They were...
Seriously?
Oh!
Wow.
Grammarians were honored in such a way. They had a refined education, and there was a famous grammarian called Lollianos, and he appears in the papyri from Oxyrhynchus. And he is actually unhappy with his salary. So he is writing to petition to the emperor.
In Rome?
Yeah.
Wow.
To tell him that he would like to have a little orchard, so then he could cultivate it. And then, interesting, at the end he said, so I could be a better teacher for the children.
Of course. Charming. So you also write in your book that educators in antiquity, in the Greco-Roman world, were considered guardians and preservers of a very precious tradition. That seems like the opposite of education today, where every college is trying to advertise to the students, oh, we have like the most cutting-edge subjects, and
Yeah, completely.
our textbooks have the latest satellite images,
Yeah.
And so...
But then, I was looking at the curriculum of Harvard in the 17th century. Very similar to the curriculum of antiquity, with Latin and Greek and, not much science, math, a little bit. So this kind of model continued.
Yeah.
But I think it is almost unbelievable that education consisted of literature and no other things. That's it. So that bothers me a little bit. What I like of ancient education is they really gave people lots of skills that now we are losing in certain respects. And that's why I studied Greek and Latin, this.
Can you say a bit more about that? Like, what are the skills that you think you get from this ancient education that we're losing gradually today?
First of all, the education under the grammarian was very detailed. The grammarian taught you how to do exegesis, really an explanation, to write an exegesis of a book. And if you look at what we have in terms of, scholars in antiquity, this type of education produced very good people. And then declaiming. Quintilian presents the case of this boy, probably, 16, 17, who is on his bed. He has to write an assignment, he has to write a declamation, and he cannot do it, he's tossing and turning. And Quintilian says to him, but come on, you can do better, just follow all these rules. We don't have many rules today, we have definitely less. But I have to say that if I teach a freshman seminar, and I also have to look at their English skills, I think of the rules of antiquity. Okay, so first of all, in a story, you write a poem. Then you have to write the narration. Then the proofs. So you follow the structure so well, and the structure accompanies you. I think this was very positive.
On that note, Raffaella Cribiore, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
All right, a quick announcement about the podcast. We are going on a short recess for the summer. We need a little break, and I especially have a lot of catching up to do on my own thesis. So next month, there will be no episode. But we're very excited about what we have planned for you in the fall. We'll be back in September with a very special guest coming on the show to talk about comedy. In the meantime, stay in touch through our website, greasepodcast.com, or via Facebook and Twitter. Our handle is @greasepodcast. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover in the future. And if you'd like to support the show, please leave us a review through your listening app to help get the word out about the podcast. To all of you listening in the Northern Hemisphere, have a wonderful summer. Thanks for listening to Ancient Greece, Declassified.
Can you still sing Orpheus? Then sing something that's going to last. 1,000 years slips by so fast, goes off into a dusty myth with you.